Hello, everybody. My name is Autumn Cogdill, and I will be presenting my policy change project today, which I have chosen to do on state-funded preschool education in South Dakota. So just to give some background of the topic, South Dakota is currently one of 6 states who do not provide state-funded preschool education. What they do provide are Birth to 3 programs and the Head Start program, which primarily emphasizes guidance for special needs children and low-income families in South Dakota. So today what I'm proposing for my policy change is that South Dakota does offer state-funded preschool education, as there are a lot of factual evidence to support how this is beneficial to children's success into adulthood. Research suggests that pre-K programs create long-term benefits in the social, cognitive, and behavioral development of children into adulthood. There were actually 2 studies that were conducted to show the effectiveness of pre-K programs, one of which was called the Perry study. This study showed that there was a 0.9 standard deviation of cognitive abilities among preschool students, as well as increased test scores and better classroom behavior. A second study that was conducted was by the Institute for Developmental Studies, which found that preschool programs, children that were involved with them tended to have lower crime rates into adulthood. They also had a lowered special education placement rate when in their early developmental years of kindergarten through 6th grade, and higher graduation rates. Elaborating on the lower crime rate statistic, these studies showed that arrests by the age of 27 were shown to have decreased by 50%, which is quite a substantial amount. So it's very clear and evident that preschool education is critical to the success of children. Moving forward here, we can go ahead and take a look at my policy change proposal from the state, local, and tribal levels. At the state level, there are generally 3 funding mechanisms that a state could use. They are called the general fund appropriations, block grants, or funding formulas. If South Dakota were to use the general fund appropriations approach, that would mean that our state officials would have to use federal money that we receive from the government as part of our annual budget. For pre-K, our officials would have to allocate some of the state funding for pre-K programs, which would mean that it would also be susceptible to budget cuts if our state were to ever be in a financial deficit. Another way that South Dakota could implement this policy at the state level would be through block grants. A block grant is issued by the government to states for educational funding, and generally these grants are distributed to specific areas and schools that have children with higher needs. I think that a block grant could benefit South Dakota in starting state-funded preschool education programs, because our state has several counties that would be considered of low socioeconomic statuses and higher risk. And lastly, funding formulas would be a third way that South Dakota could implement this policy at the state level. A funding formula typically goes off of a per student or per pupil basis. So, for example, if South Dakota were to set a certain budget for preschool programs, then for these programs we would have to evaluate how many children would be involved with them, and then see how much of those funds we could put per student per school year. The only shortcomings of this type of method, the funding formula, as well as the general funds appropriations approach, would be that there's never going to be a guarantee of funds. There could always be a deficit, and nothing is ever set in stone financially, which is one way that this would be something that South Dakota maybe would want to evaluate before they jump into using these approaches. Next, we'll take a look at the local level. If South Dakota were to implement this policy at the local level, we would be looking at how we could do that at the county and district levels. And funding for this at this level, usually comes from specific streams. That being said, usually what one might propose is increasing sales taxes, or in this case, what I found to be that would maybe be more beneficial for South Dakota would be if we could incorporate sin taxes. Now, sin taxes are taxes on goods that are considered to be harmful to the body, tobacco, alcohol, soda, pop, candy, all those foods that we could incorporate a higher tax on, which in turn could also deter that type of behavior. So if we were to incorporate some taxes on, let's say, alcohol or tobacco, that could help increase revenue for South Dakota to fund pre-K programs, but also creating another public health benefit by potentially detering those consumers from using as much alcohol and tobacco. Next, we'll take a look at the tribal level for implementing this policy. One thing that I found interesting just throughout my research of this project was that there are actually several programs out there that cater specifically to the tribal communities when it comes to receiving government funding or educational grants. One initiative that I found that I decided to write about is the Tribal Early Learning Initiative, which is essentially a funding program that tribal communities can apply for, and that grant or that funding gets the tribal community will receive it, and it specifically goes towards educational improvements, and it would be a way that South Dakota could get funding for preschool on those reservations in our state as well. South Dakota is actually one of the states that is not in network with this program. So that's why I suggest that South Dakota works, maybe send some of our state officials and tribal communities, get some of those tribal leaders as well to meet with the Tribal Early Learning Initiative, those officials, and try to get us on board with this program. That way we can go ahead and start implementing preschool programs on these communities. The Tribal Early Learning Initiative's goals are to support tribal early learning development, create early childhood systems, improve the quality of services for children from the day they're born to kindergarten entry. So basically having a main emphasis on those early developmental years, so like 0 to 3, 0 to 4, preschool ages. And they also want to tackle barriers for collaboration improvement. The Tribal Early Learning Initiative partners up with the Administration for Children's and Families and tribes with Head Start and other early childhood programs. I think that South Dakota could definitely benefit from this at the tribal level. Moving on, I will go ahead and discuss some of the health implications of this policy change. By providing pre-K programs, I would think that South Dakota could expect to see improvements in the behavior, health, and cognitive skills of youth. Children involved with preschool programs have been shown to have positive impacts on their emotional and behavioral health, which also has been proven to reduce criminal activity into adulthood. South Dakota could also expect to see a decrease in the number of children that are needing special education help and a fewer amount of children needing to repeat grades. Actually, the Perry study proves that this is true, as their research suggested that the grade retention and special education rates fell from 38 to 17% after the children had been enrolled in preschool programs. It's also shown that early preschool programs can help children become more advanced in their cognitive abilities, which I went on and thought that this could reduce the amount of money needed to fund Title I programs for special needs children. And then this additional money could actually be used to fund preschool programs in South Dakota as part of a state-funded program. Overall, the health implications show a positive impact in the development for children. Moving on, I'll discuss further action steps that can be taken to get this policy implemented. The last step of the CDC policy framework is to develop a strategy for adaptation of state-funded preschool programs. So these steps include clarifying operational issues, conveying information, and conducting additional background work. The first step in South Dakota adopting this policy would be by having the school systems determine if they would be good candidates to receive state funding for the preschool program. This would include assessing if they might have enough children to actually start up a preschool program to receive the funding. I think that each school system would have to send a representative to the state capitol and speak with our elected officials, since this is where the policy would get enacted. The next step would be to write a white paper background that disseminates all research and data to our state elected officials and the general public. Our state elected officials would have to meet with tribal leaders to see what would be the best way to implement funding for preschool programs in those communities. From here, our officials would determine if the policy would be implemented. And conveying information, step 3, a way to promote parents to send their children to preschool would be by providing them with factual evidence and statistics. So one way that South Dakota could convey the pros and cons to parents would be by having informational booths set up at preschool facilities when those parents are, quote, shopping around for the best. Every parent's going to be looking around. They want to know what each preschool program has to offer, or if some of them are reluctant to send their children to preschool programs, maybe these informational booths can persuade them by showing how the pros outweigh the cons of sending your child to a preschool program. The pros definitely outweigh the cons to South Dakota developing a state-funded preschool program policy. However, it might be a little bit difficult to pass if it were to ever actually be considered by South Dakota. I say this because in an interview that was conducted with Billy Sutton in 2017, he said that one of the biggest reasons that South Dakota has not attempted to fund preschool is money. He elaborated on this by saying that South Dakota has a tough time passing sales tax increases, which is where the state funding would have to come from. But hopefully with more time and research, South Dakota could possibly find ways to increase our revenue stream so that way children would have an opportunity to succeed starting at the preschool age. And this is why I propose that South Dakota implements a state-funded preschool program education. Thank you for listening.